This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. In our quest to ensure a woman's seat at the table, some would argue we've left men behind. A Pew Research Center report found there's a growing need for high-skilled workers in the American workplace, ones who are adept in negotiation, persuasion, and critical thinking. So the labor market is placing a higher priority on college degrees. While men are still overrepresented in positions of power, women have outnumbered them on college campuses for half a century, and the gender gap is growing larger every year. This trend is part of what's fueling provocateurs like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, because changing social norms that diminish the traditional male role of economic provider also challenge the social script for masculinity, and many men fear they're confronting the prospect cultural redundancy. Joining me to break down how men have been pushed to the sidelines is Idrees Kahloon, D.C. bureau chief for The Economist. In his recent piece for The New Yorker, he asked, "What's the matter with men?" Idrees Kahloon, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, this is the Helen of Troy of topics. It's the topic that's launched 1,000 think pieces and approaching as many books, and often the premise is stated as a given rather than as a question. So why don't we start there? If you take all the metrics we commonly use to chart personal milestones and then aggregate them into the kind of stats we commonly use to chart quality of life, is the position of men and boys eroding in America?
I think that there are a lot of indicators that are going in the wrong direction, and they are occurring at different stages of life. So in the education system, we see a lot of boys are falling behind girls in terms of aptitude, performance on reading exams, but also graduation rates. They're more likely to have discipline problems. And that has resulted in a fairly stark reversal in the community of undergraduates who now are dominated to a large extent by women. Women are also making great strides in terms of becoming a clear majority in graduate programs such as law and medicine. And that's not just due to the fact that women are doing better. It's also that men seem to be, and young boys in particular, seem to be falling behind in their education. And then if you look further on into middle age and adulthood, what you see is that a number of men are dropping out of the labor force. So the labor force participation rate for men has been slowly, over the last few decades, dropping. That's led to some convergence, but a lot of it is this issue among men that is hard to understand. And you see also, everyone is familiar with the deaths of despair literature, this argument about the rise in opioid overdose deaths, alcoholism, suicides. A lot of that has been pronounced among men themselves. So I think if you combine all of those things together, you see that those statistical series are not going in the right direction for men.
If broadly stated, wages are rising, if broadly stated, workforce participation is level at a time when millions of people are retiring, if the number of BAs is increasing, if the percentage of youngsters who graduate high school is increasing, why is it important to disaggregate and know that males are hitting these milestones in a different way from females?
Well, in the same way that disaggregating by race is often important. It uncovers trends. It allows us to understand what sorts of social policies and processes are at play that are leading to disparities. Obviously, men and women are different from disaggregation for African Americans vis-a-vis whites. But if you take a look at the gender gap, the fact that these are fairly large in some arenas in education doesn't necessarily mean that sexism is over. I don't think that's true at all. But take, for example, you mentioned the labor force participation rate is flat. If that's flat because men are declining and women are increasing, I think you should want to know why, and you should want to explore that. And people have tried to do that, but I think that there's been somewhat less attention to this because it is hard to think about a previously dominant group, as men have been for centuries and millennia, having this fairly fast erosion. And our ability to think about that is, I think, a little bit stilted at times.
Our ability to think about it. I'm glad you mentioned the millennia-long domination of men, because it seems like it's hard to have a calm, dry-eyed, level-headed, evidence-based conversation about this topic because women were objectively, unquestionably hampered in their progress for centuries. And many of them, would question that they are evening the score because if you look at the pinnacles of power, influence, wealth, they're all still disproportionately dominated, inhabited by men. So when you try to talk about the problems of men, do you sometimes get an eye roll rather than concern?
I think that you do. And obviously there has to be a sensitivity to how you talk about these issues for exactly the reasons that you lay out. Some people take it to the extreme, Jordan Peterson and others, and suggest that men are now oppressed relative to women because of some of these indicators. And I don't think that's a helpful frame, and I don't think it's correct, furthermore. But nonetheless, I think it is important to, when you can, try to have an empirical conversation about what is happening, what these trend lines are, and more importantly, try to understand what is causing them. Why are men more likely to commit suicide? Why are men falling behind in education? Why are they overdosing at higher rates? These are fairly important questions that I think sometimes, that eye roll that you talk about inhibits our ability to actually investigate because that's not seen as a credible research question.
You're a data guy. You use data in your reporting quite a bit. What initially grabbed your attention about this issue?
My initial interest in this issue came from actually a few years ago when I was looking at just the labor force participation rates for America and saw this sort of long run decline that's observable only among men. And I started to wonder why that was. And, I started reading more, compiling a notebook of these sorts of things, and never really managed to write that stuff up. But a few months ago, the Brookings scholar Richard Reeves wrote a book called Of Men and Boys, which synthesized in a way that I felt jealous that I had not been able to, even though I'd been gathering these notes, synthesized a lot of what was going on, and I think actually meaningfully advanced this argument because it didn't fall back on this sort of cultural revanchism that you see is popular among the alt-right. It was a sober recitation of facts, and that got me interested in writing about the subject as well.
Well, I've been working for close to 50 years, full-time, and I sometimes think about this as a hardware-software question. There's the world of correcting data sets for years of education and annual and hourly income, the number of school suspensions and trying to disaggregate girls and boys, hard numbers. And then there's the softer world of what you might describe as an unfolding social drama. How do we think about these questions? How do we think about success and about gender? When the women's movement put before society at large for its consideration, when I was just entering the workforce, the notion that women were as intelligent, as hardworking, as ambitious, as useful as men, at the same time, in its wake, was put forward another set of propositions, that there were women's values useful to the workplace, the ability to listen, to cooperate, to work in teams, to stay on task, being empathetic, being nurturing, as attributes, as aspects of women's nature, a phrase that I'm, granted, cautious about using. These were held up as good things, and unquestionably they are. I mean, who's going to speak against empathy? Nobody. But I'm sometimes stumped when I try to think of a similar list of male attributes that are considered praiseworthy, associated with positive things. I'm not sure we tell men and boys a similar story about manhood, that there are attributes that are worthy and good, as we saw women being reinforced by in the early days of the women's movement all the way up to today. Is there a problem with the way we're socializing men and boys to think about being men and boys?
That's a very important question. It's also one that's very hard to answer quantitatively, right? It's a cultural zeitgeist sort of opinion. And I think that there are, like you identified, many shifts happening. You have the women's rights movement, which has really reshaped American society over the last century. You have, at the same time, an economic transformation that moves us away from brawn and towards brains. Previously, it used to be that strength might have been one of those adjectives, but that's less paid for in the workplace today. So all of those transformations are happening, as well as a decline in religiosity, which is where a lot of people's values were socialized from. So America is having to craft a sort of new set of moral values. But I think that there are aspects of masculinity which has always been in some amount of tension because there have always been very different conceptions of what the ideal man ought to be. But there are some aspects like strength or honesty, strength of character, that one could use even today and could socialize boys towards that I think would be positively beneficial in the workplace. I don't think it's simply a story of we move towards an empathetic workplace and women are better equipped to be empathetic, and therefore that explains all of this. I think that it's a complicated question. There is a lot going on, but I think your point about values is a correct one, but it's also one of the hardest ones to answer with precision.
I've been watching this unfolding social drama with great interest. My children are boys and girls, and I watch the way they get socialized differently, and it's fascinating to me, but I see in the men's movement, such as it is, I see in the work of a book by a U.S. senator about manhood and in the YouTube videos of Jordan Peterson, an embedded tendency, maybe even unconscious tendency, to view these questions in zero-sum terms, that if women are succeeding or thriving or doing better, since there's a finite amount of achievement, status, security, money, that men inevitably are going to get less, that this isn't a better world for them if the women in their lives are doing better. And it really hobbles the whole conversation.
Yeah, I don't think that framework is helpful. I think that if women are doing better and men are doing better, then that's obviously the best scenario that we can hope for. And I think that if you look on the whole, obviously women being able to be educated and go into the labor force has been hugely beneficial for men. The particular issue is that in some of these areas, on education and labor force participation, men are declining. And that, I think, is a concern. And it doesn't need to be that women need to be kept down in order for that trend to be ameliorated. But your point about Josh Hawley's book on manhood, which is coming out soon, and Jordan Peterson, I think points to a very important issue, which is that this is an issue that has been seized upon by the right. The right is thinking about how this issue began, and they're thinking about what needs to be done to change it. And I think that they think of this as a decline of values, a decline of traditional conservative values that need to be reinstated. And the left, I think, is uncomfortable with these sorts of conversations because men were, still are, so dominant, and theorizing about why there might be disparities that point in the opposite direction of what is expected is difficult. And so what that means is that the informational landscape that you're talking about is dominated by people who are, I think, not approaching this in a level-headed way, that aren't thinking about it also in a way that's oriented towards the future, because you can't reclaim the past however hard you try to. It's not a real solution that's being offered to men, but we also see that lots of men who are in their early 20s and such are captivated by these people. They are thinking about their place in contemporary society. They don't know where to get those values from. So they gravitate towards people like Josh Hawley and people like Jordan Peterson. And I think that it's important to construct maybe not a counter narrative, but something else that men can gravitate to, because they are going to have these existential questions.
Is there a collision at the intersection of economics and society here? I find this conversation inevitably drenched in nostalgia, because before long, somebody's yearning for some other time when things were presumably better. A white man coming out of World War II, let's say, from a family where they couldn't have imagined that he would have gotten a college degree, but he got one, funded by the government. He knew he only had to compete for life's goodies against other white men. Women's ambitions were largely confined. Racial and ethnic minorities in many places in the country weren't even allowed to get in the race. Is some of the anxiety about a lost presumption of status, place, expectations, driving the idea of a permanent crisis, this malaise, the deaths of despair even? Are these things being driven by what's essentially the yearning for a time where we caught lightning in a bottle and are unlikely to do it again?
I think nostalgia is one of the most powerful political forces that there is. The dominating slogan of Donald Trump's campaign is to make America great again. It's to return back to this time when America was great. But I don't think it's confined just to Trump. I think you see Vladimir Putin definitely appropriates that sort of language. He talks about the heroism of World War II as he tries to prosecute this campaign in Ukraine. Even on the left, you see Joe Biden talk about unions and sort of pine for these days when unions were powerful in the decades after the war. They were, of course, marred with the same racial discrimination and animus that pervaded society at that time as well. So I think that this nostalgia is something that is incredibly powerful. I don't think it's necessarily maybe in a subconscious way, it is related to this feeling of domination and yearning for it. But I think that there is good data to suggest that people's children are less likely to make more than their parents than at any point in the last half century. And that to people, that economic anxiety is, I think, a powerful motivator in addition to these political ones as well.
Traditionally in American society, it's been looked upon with indulgence, understanding, expectation that a man would certainly have the privilege to marry a woman of lesser social standing, lesser income, and lesser educational attainment. Men could marry down, women could not, is the old formula. In a world where women are outstripping men in earning 2-year, 4-year, and graduate degrees, that's going to call into question that model, and I think pretty quickly, and force the kind of change that might take normally a really long time and force it to happen in a lifetime. A man with what the Census Bureau calls some college, meaning they went to some but didn't finish a credential, some college, will marry a woman with a 4-year degree or a master's degree down the road. And we're looking at the conditions to change a pretty old-fashioned social model pretty soon, aren't we?
Yeah. I think you will see that given just the mechanics of the number of women who are getting these college degrees and graduate degrees. You will see that, right? That's a natural consequence of that. What I'm interested in as well is this concept of associative mating, where, it's a sort of bloodless term, but what it means is that people with college degrees are disproportionately marrying other people with college degrees. This sort of marrying down phenomenon among men existed 50 or 60 years ago when women really weren't going to graduate education or undergraduate education. And what we see now are the consequences of this fact that educated people tend to marry educated people and people with just high school degrees tend to marry each other. For one, marriages at the higher end of the education distribution tend to be more stable. They tend to foster children without as much divorce. And they also tend to earn more, both parents. And cumulatively, I think that has consequences for housing prices, the fact that people want to move to certain kinds of places, the kinds of schooling that they end up doing. I mean, it compounds advantage upon advantage in a way that I think really ties into the increasing income segregation that we see in this country. It can have consequences for racial segregation as well, depending on precisely who's marrying who. And, I think that you end up with a solidified class inequality that I don't see getting better because of these marriage trends in a way that is quite deep.
You've done good work measuring, identifying the problem. Are there policies that look plausible and attractive that would give men the opportunity to round up and to not consciously feel like they're chasing women, but to achieve better for themselves?
Yeah. So in Richard Reeves's book, which is what inspired me to write that piece, he mentions a few that I think would be helpful. One is to increase the number of vocational schools. I think that makes sense. The Germans have had pretty good success with that as well. And he also mentions the need to get men into what he calls heel jobs, which are jobs like nursing, jobs like caretaking and childcare and elder care that men have not participated in, I think because there is a stigma associated with them. So this destigmatization is important, but those are the careers of the future. We will always need people to do those sorts of jobs, and he encourages men to do them and point to them. But I think we do really need to understand what is going on within schools, but also within families. There's some emerging research that suggests that boys are actually, when they're young, more sensitive to adverse childhood events than girls are. And if that's the case, then maybe we need to rethink, and that requires some insights from sociology. It requires some insights from child psychology as well. It's not going to be entirely simple, but there are some things that you could do that would help.
Given the state of both understanding the nature of the challenge and starting to think about how to fix it, is this going to be with us for a while to come, and really as a political flashpoint, as a social flashpoint, rather than sort of a technocratic problem to be noodled over? Are we going to have to live with this for some time to come?
Yeah, and I think we're already living with it. We're already seeing the right seize upon these ideas of reclaiming a lost masculinity in the past as a powerful impetus for themselves. And it's filled the void of, I think the Republican Party doesn't have very much of a policy agenda at the moment, post-Trump. But this sort of nostalgia, this sort of feelings, and there are a lot of other feelings compounded with that, nativism, populism, etc. But you're already seeing the political movement that this can be channeled into. It's easy to say that technocratic solutions kind of bore people, and I understand that, but it's important because, like you said, the downstream effects politically and socially are going to be big, and I think we're already experiencing them.
Idrees Kahloon joined The Economist in 2016. He writes in the New Yorker magazine about the problems with men and masculinity. He's the D.C. bureau chief for The Economist, where he covers American politics and policy from the nation's capital. I'm going to excuse myself and go chop some wood and lift some weights, but good to talk to you.
Great to talk to you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by our intern, Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimp. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Young is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.